What's going on, guys? Today we're gonna be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is the deadlift. And more specifically, tips for taller lifters to execute great deadlifts. So I had my man Philip reach out and ask me about creating a video on this topic. He's 6'4", and he was mentioning that his hips often shoot up way too quickly when doing the deadlift, and he has a tough time maintaining tension and creating a nice harmonious flow with the knees and the hips. When we're taller individuals, we have to be a bit more strategic with how we leverage our joints in the barbell movements. Typically, the barbell movements are not our best friends. We have longer legs, we need to sink to a deeper range of motion. We have longer arms, we have to come down way further in the bench press. On the deadlift, it can go either way. Why? Well, if you have long arms, you can actually excel at the deadlift if you're a taller individual. However, if you're kind of built equally with the arm length and leg length, then you have to be a tiny bit more strategic with how you're positioning yourself. So now let's dive into the tips. And tip number one is start with your hips a little bit higher than you think. So for this tip, I want you to video yourself from the side, and I want you to get yourself into a position where the hips are generally a bit higher than what you've probably been doing if you're having issues, especially with the hips shooting up too fast. And I want you to focus on videoing yourself from the side and using a 2 to 3 second concentric tempo in the lifting portion. So I want you to slow down off the floor, and I want you to really focus on what the hips are doing. If your hips are still shooting up, focus on one, pulling the bar in nice and tight and creating a good level of tension before you break the floor, but two, bringing the hips up slightly more and really focusing on creating that nice tension in the glutes and hamstrings. Generally, when we slow down and video ourselves from the side, it's the perfect combination to see what might be happening. And if you notice that your hips are shooting up too quickly, raise them up a little bit higher at the start of your deadlift. But now that brings us to tip number two. Now that our hip positioning is a tad higher than what we're used to, what I want you to think about is bringing the knees forward a little bit and still maintaining a midfoot bar position. If you're a taller individual with longer legs, a bit more forward knee translation is not necessarily a bad thing. So as long as we're maintaining tension in the hamstrings and glutes and we bring our legs forward a tiny bit, so our knees forward a little bit, what we're gonna be able to do is use and leverage our legs a bit more. When you're taller, you have a long way to pull that weight. So how can you help yourself and just create a nice synergistic pull? It's by using the legs a lot more and really driving into the ground. So with your higher hip position, I want you to think about, as you break the floor, pushing the legs down like a leg press and really leveraging the quads to help you get that bar moving. Generally, this nice balance of push and pull will help your knees and hips stay in a little bit more of like a harmonious nature where the hips aren't shooting up too quickly. Because if we're only focusing on the posterior as a taller individual, we might be trying to maintain an unrealistic vertical shin angle and just be putting ourselves into a position that's not really anatomically friendly for the deadlift and our body. Now, let's dive into tip number three. Tip number three is taking tip number one, tip number two, putting them together and then slowing down. So what I want you to do is use a lighter load and then focus on doing a 2 to 3 second concentric tempo. And if you notice your hips are shooting up a little bit, you can even add a pause at the mid shin. I think way too often we think we have to rush the concentric and be powerful all the time in the deadlift, but slowing down is the best way to help us be hyper cognizant of our positioning and then cue better positioning based off of what we are interpreting. So let's say we are having the hips raised still too quickly and we have a 2 to 3 second concentric tempo. That's gonna be very easy to identify. So what we can do then is readjust our hip positioning, our knee positioning, and find something that works. And then by doing this slower tempo, we are gonna start reinforcing this idea of where we need to be positioned for every single rep and help us create tension more consistently throughout our deadlift sessions. Doing slower movement is not a bad thing, and I think for taller lifters who are having issues with their hips shooting up too quickly, slowing down and lightening the load a little bit can be a great tool for helping you understand how you should be positioning yourself to optimally pull the weight. Now, tip number four is stop oversetting the scaps. So a common cue we hear with deadlifts is retract the scaps and put them in the back pocket. But let's think about this for a second. If you're a taller individual, you can really leverage your arm length, and that's gonna be a good thing for your deadlift. And let's talk about when we're setting. If we're taking the scaps and retracting them, what we're gonna do is, look, we're bringing the arms in, and then what ends up happening? So as we set and pull these in, once we start to pull, especially with heavier loads, we're gonna have more protraction, which is gonna make us feel like we don't have a lot of tension throughout the torso. So what I would recommend doing instead, if you are over retracting and like trying to set super hard at the bottom, is just think about the arms as hooks, create a little bit of tension in the lat, so just contract a little bit, but don't bring the scaps back. Don't retract the scaps, just think about having long arms. And then as you pull and as weight gets heavier, this cueing system I think will be a lot better for your mechanics, because as you are a taller individual, you may have a bit more thoracic and upper back rounding compared to somebody who doesn't have to lift the weight nearly as far, but that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as our form isn't breaking down to a huge degree or we're having a lot of stress displaced into the lumbar spine. We're always gonna have some flexion in the back, and as a taller individual, use and leverage your arms. These can be your best tools in the deadlift, and oversetting this shit in the setup is one of the easiest ways to start limiting your potential, because you're already limiting some of the way you have to pull that weight. Let your arms do their thing and let them be hooks in the deadlift. My fifth tip is to limit the overall range of motion that you need to pull the weight. And so what I mean by this is that if you're wearing big training shoes that have a big stack height, limit those. That might help you with your positioning a little bit. So go barefoot, wear Converse, wear deadlift slippers, wear something that's gonna give you less stack height and put you closer to the ground. If you're taller, it's a game of inches. We need to get as flat as we can to that ground so we can leverage our mechanics accordingly. Another thing to think about is to ask yourself, do I really need to be pulling off the ground? And what I mean by this is that if you're not a powerlifting athlete or somebody who wants to specifically improve their deadlift off the ground, if you have a really tough time getting into positioning correctly with the traditional barbell deadlift, raise your deadlift onto like a 25 or 45 pound plate and try pulling from there. More likely you're gonna have a better positioning in doing this, and it's not like a rack pull where we're not gonna get a nice stimulus. You're still pulling the weight a very long way, especially if you are a very tall individual, and you're likely gonna be set up correctly, and you're not gonna necessarily need to worry about your overall deadlift strength, because if you're not a powerlifter or somebody who's competing with the deadlift, you really don't need to pull from the floor if it's extremely tough for you to get into positioning when doing so. So that's just something to think about. I'm not saying don't deadlift. What I am saying is that if you're not really that goal focused with your deadlift, stop trying to fit a square peg into a round hole and just make this movement a little bit more mechanically friendly for you. Lifting up your barbell by 2 to 4 inches isn't gonna necessarily limit your pull. It's not gonna necessarily make it a block pull right away, and you're still gonna get a nice high stimulus from this. All right, to my tall friends, hopefully these tips help you out and make your positioning a little bit better. If you ever have anything specific that you wanna ask, feel free to hit me on Instagram at Jake_Bully and send videos if you want. I would love to work a bit more hand in hand with you with your form if you're still having issues with your deadlift. Tips can only do so much, especially on YouTube, and sometimes having more of a curated eye to what's going on is a little bit better. So don't be afraid to take me up on that. And if you have any questions on this video, hit me in the comments below. And as always, guys, drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one.